Am I coming through? Yeah, nice. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the importance of standardization in medical cannabis and what that actually means. You want closer? Is that better? Yeah. So, yeah, we've got to think, what is standardization? And this basically means controlling everything that you do whilst you're making a product. So controlling variables to ensure repeatable results, making sure that what you make comes out the same each time. Ensuring a process or procedure is the same each time, so when you're actually doing things, you're doing the same thing each time. You know, whatever it is, it has to be consistent throughout. And ensuring a compound or preparation is of a known composition. So again, knowing exactly what chemicals are inside the thing we're making and how much of them are in there. So then, why is standardization important? Well, when we change those variables, we get different results each time. If you're making a cannabis oil and you're soaking it in alcohol, and you soak it for longer, you're going to pull different chemical compounds than if you soak it for a shorter period of time. That's just one instance of how a variable can affect the composition of your product. And when we control variables in our experiments, it ensures this repeatability. So we make sure that every time we're getting the same thing again. And in clinical trials, this standardization is crucial to prove that what we're actually trying to assess is the compound that we're looking at. So they've recognized this since 1902. This was published in the California State Journal of Medicine. And yeah, so it says, the condition has grown so much worse within the last few years that at present the physician who writes a prescription has no certainty that it will be compounded alike by two druggists using preparations of different manufacturers, and he's being forced to prescribe semi-proprietary mixtures, the actual composition of which he is in ignorance, and the valuable and wonderful properties of which are being constantly urged upon him, not by anyone with authority to speak, but the manufacturer who can see nothing except the advantage of lauding his mixture and the consequent dollars that may be added to his bank account. The comparisons between this and the medical marijuana industry that we see today in the US are almost scary, you know. And you can say that if you were getting a cannabis oil, a FICO or an RSO sort of oil, if it's from a different batch, it will likely never be the same, never truly identical. You can get it very similar, but it will never be identical. So to illustrate the point why this is important, if you went to see a medical marijuana doctor in California, say, and they write you a prescription, now what is that prescription actually for? Does he write you a prescription for White Widow, or does he write you a prescription for some kind of cannabis with a certain level of THC or with a certain level of CBD? And if it's just one of those things, what about the other variables? So if he says you need 20% THC, what about the CBD content? These are all things that it makes the whole system not medicinal. And there's no way that the doctor can ensure that you really get the medicine that you need for your condition. So, yeah, medical marijuana without standardization, it goes much further than just sort of indica and sativa plants. If you go to a coffee shop in the Netherlands, or if you go to a medical marijuana dispensary in the US, and you buy, say, White Widow from 5 different shops, you're going to get 5 different plants with completely different chemical composition. And it goes further than that as well. If you plant seeds, there's something called phenotype variation. And that basically means unless a strain has been stabilized through generations of selective breeding, every seed you plant is going to produce a completely different phenotype, which has different cannabinoid contents, different terpene content, different ratios. So even if you're buying seeds and you say, yeah, this is White Widow, it doesn't mean anything about the strain of weed. It doesn't say anything about the last batch of White Widow you got. There is natural phenotype variation in all cannabis like this that is grown from seed. And even when you're using clones, when you're using genetically identical cuttings, you can get variations in the final percentage, so depending on how it's grown. And that brings on to the next one. This is actually GW Pharmaceuticals, who got their license in the UK in 1998 to grow medical cannabis. It's a completely standardized operation, so the light is controlled in there, the humidity, the temperature, everything that they're being fed, and even the chemotype. So when they first started, they planted thousands and thousands of seeds, they tested all of them, and then they picked the ones that had the chemical composition that they desired for their products. And without controlling all of these, the product will have different chemical composition each time. So light intensity can alter your cannabinoid content, for instance. So if you're not changing your bulbs regularly, and you've got a corner of that garden that is getting less light, the chemical composition of those plants can actually vary, even though they're genetically identical cuttings. So now with standardization in extraction of cannabis, there's two sort of main things here, and it depends on whether you want an isolated compound or whether you want a full spectrum extract. So if you're working with isolated compounds, then any starting material can be used. THC is THC. It doesn't matter where it came from. If you use fresh plants or if you use trim that's 3 years old, it's irrelevant. On a molecular level, the compound is the same. And the same is true of CBD and all of the other cannabinoids. If you're getting something to that 99% and above purity, the source is largely irrelevant. Now, if you're talking about a full spectrum extract with all of the cannabinoids in the plant, then it's different because the chemical composition of the plant you're extracting from will be what determines the composition of your extract. Yeah, this one, nothing is new in cannabis. You know, we like to think that we're innovating all the time, and we see these huge progress in the scene. You know, cannabis oil explodes on the scene, and we've got all these new techniques for extracting, and none of it's new. You know, so basic solvent extracts, tea and tisanes, go back to over 1000 BC. You know, that's just a simple water extract of some of the chemicals in tea. Distillation has been traced back to 2000 CE. That was for the purposes of removing salt from seawater or for making alcohol stronger. And that's something that's very recently come onto the cannabis scene. So now you're starting to see isolated THC, 90% and upwards purity. And it's a very thick oil, but it's chemically different from just solvent extracts because you're removing everything except the THC. And this started coming about 2013, 2014. It started getting really big in the US. And it was a big industry secret for a long time. But it's a process that's thousands of years old. So by 1879, the Soxhlet extractor was invented. And by 2011, we really see the cannabis oil scene start to explode with a guy called Grey Wolf, who is from Skunk Farm Research, if any of you know that, a good website. And he was actually an aerospace engineer who decided to start looking at closed-loop extraction equipment, so a level up from just spraying a can of butane through a glass tube. So as the industry grows, and you know, it's growing from nothing really. Cannabis oil has existed for years, sure, but the commercialization of it, the availability of it on a huge scale, it's a very recent thing. So as we grow out of this, and as more and more medicinal benefits are being recognized to this plant, then obviously advancements will come. So one of the first ones that we saw in the cannabis oil scene was the need for vacuum ovens and some other professional machinery. Back when I started, the recommendations for, well, the internet recommendations for purging an extract were, yeah, put it on a radiator, leave it for a few hours, and you'll boil your solvent off, and then you're good to go. There would be huge levels of residual solvent contamination in there. It's now that we're starting to see professional pharmaceutical equipment coming in, so vacuum ovens and rotovapes down there, machines specifically built for removing that solvent you extract with. Along with that, clean solvents. So lots of you will have heard of RSO, Rick Simpson oil. When he first suggested to make this cannabis oil, he told people to use naphtha, which is a very crude, unrefined solvent that can actually have a benzene contamination in it. And it's very difficult to purge that solvent. It's very difficult to remove it from the extract. So we've evolved from there, and now people are using clean, proper solvents. People are recognizing the need to actually do what they're doing within a laboratory rather than in their back garden or even in the kitchen. That's crucial for making sure your extract is clean and you can follow those standardized procedures. Analytical testing, that's a new one that we're starting to see as well, and people are realizing just how important that is to know what you're getting, because there's no way to know. You cannot look at something, you cannot smell it and tell how much THC is in it or how much CBD is in it. That's not how this works. There's no way to reliably determine that except with analytical testing. And even that has its problems, which I'll come on to in a minute. The other thing we see with the evolution of the industry is professionals enter the industry. So 5-10 years ago, it was incredibly rare to hear of people with degrees or PhDs even working in the cannabis scene. Now it's almost routine practice in certain states in the US, and that is inevitable as well. We also see in a more medicinal clinical setting the introduction of GMP, GLP, and GCLP laboratories. That's good manufacturing practice, good laboratory practice, and good clinical laboratory practice. And that's standards that are set for laboratories that are producing these products. So testing, it's a step in the right direction. Now you have a few different kinds of testing for cannabis. TLC is thin layer chromatography, and that's like you see here, this picture, it's a sheet of sort of paper almost, and you dissolve some of your whatever you're testing, and you put a little drop on the bottom line, and the different compounds in the mixture will move up the paper at different speeds. So you can see you've got different points on there where there's the presence of certain compounds in high levels. You've got GC, gas chromatography. That's a method that is good for some things in cannabis testing, but it's not the preferred method anymore. Gas chromatography works by heating up your sample, turning it into a gas, and pushing it through a column similar to the chromatography paper here. And as the compound comes out, it's detected. But in the process of turning that into a gas, you actually decarboxylate a lot of your cannabinoids. So gas chromatography will not tell you how much THCA is in your extract, for instance. And that's something that is very important if you're going to be eating the cannabis that you're consuming. HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography. This is the preferred method for testing. You dissolve your sample in a solvent and it's pumped through at a very high pressure through a column, a chromatography column, and again the different compounds come out at different speeds. They hit a detector and it gives you a peak so you can tell what and how much is in your sample. MS is mass spectrometry. That's a more complicated form of detector that can be great for pesticide analysis as well. So microbial contamination is also important. That's whether there are bacteria or molds actually living in the product. Pesticide screening, that's something we see more and more in the US at the moment, and in Canada as well. Lots of licensed producers in Canada actually have product recalls, and they have to buy cannabis from other places because they have made a commitment to provide medical cannabis for their patients, and they can't fulfill that commitment because they've tested positive for myclobutanil and other pesticides. So then they have to go to normally Bedrocan, which was a Dutch company set up who grow GMP grade cannabis, and they have to buy it off them instead. Heavy metal analysis is obviously very important. That's important in CBD products a lot as well, because hemp is a plant that's very good at removing toxins from the earth, so it will suck up heavy metals very efficiently. So if you're consuming a product that's made with hemp that's grown in China, say, where the soil is full of heavy metals, then it's important to look for some heavy metal analysis with those CBD products. Terpene analysis, so terpenes are the compounds that give the cannabis the taste and smell, just some of them. And more in the cannabis extract scene, that's becoming something that people want to know, because that's the flavor of the extracts that you're dabbing. It's really, a lot of it comes from those terpenes. And again, within extracts, you've got the residual solvent testing to see whether there's solvent in your extracts. So where do we go from here? Now, at the moment, cannabis testing is a totally unregulated industry. It's slightly different in the UK with cannabis being illegal, but in the US and elsewhere in Europe, it's unregulated. Anyone can come in and set up without any kind of oversight. Now, because generally the market is not educated as well as it could be with regards to these things, with regards to the chemical composition of their products, THC levels are prioritized above everything else. So if you go into a dispensary in the US, you want to see the highest THC levels possible, because that's going to get you the best stone. But that's really just not true. It's an attitude that I think it comes from the alcohol, prevalence of alcohol. And you know that if you drink a 5% beer, or if you drink a 9% beer, the 9% one's probably going to get you more drunk. And to some extent, it's true with THC in cannabis, but the pharmacy of it is much more complicated. There's other things in there that are changing the high as well. So a higher THC level doesn't necessarily mean a better stone or a nicer sort of high. But labs know that people just look for THC levels, and it's almost industry practice in the US now that they will inflate THC levels. So Vice did a good short video on it recently about how, there's no standardization in the testing industry. So you see these huge variations. You see people claiming that they've got cannabis flowers with 30% THC, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's just not possible. But then they have a lab test which says it as well. So this is another part of the problem, because when you can't even trust the lab analysis, well, how do you know then? It's impossible. So there needs to be regulation of the industry in this sense. And self-regulation almost never works. So the meat and dairy industry have the US Department of Agriculture in the US, and drugs and cosmetics have the Federal Drug Administration. Now you think over in the UK, the press and the police self-regulate. And I'm sure we all know that that's not really working all that well. So this brings us on to the importance of standardization in testing. So do you know how the lab operates, what it does to determine the test levels that they get? Do you know that they even have operating procedures? Have they written down the process? Or every time you send a sample into them, are they doing something slightly different and getting slightly different results? Have they standardized their procedures? Have they properly documented and ensured that the same thing is done every single time? Are samples tested multiple times to ensure accuracy? So when you're testing something like a CBD paste, the mixture isn't homogeneous, it's not properly mixed. And if you do 3 different tests on some CBD paste, you will get different test results. So the way that labs then work that out is they will take multiple tests and do an average of the 3 to determine an approximate level for the whole thing. Do they quantify with analytical standards? So when you're using this HPLC machinery, you need to feed an analytically pure sample into the machine first, so that the machine knows, oh, this is what THC looks like. Oh, this is what CBD looks like. If you haven't calibrated your machine with analytical standards, there's no way you can be entirely sure that the peak you're seeing on your graph represents what you think it does. Do they know what LOD and LOQ are? That's the limit of detection and limit of quantification. So these machines are incredibly sensitive, but they're not perfect. You can't tell if there is below a certain point in there. The machines have background noise, and actually distinguishing the compound that is there in such tiny levels from background noise on the machine You often can't do it. Those are your limits of detection and quantification. Another question would be, are the lab taking bribes for higher THC levels? Now that's, I've even seen in the US, there's someone who makes his BHO, and he doesn't even use a vacuum oven, and he's got a lab that print results for him claiming that his open-blasted BHO is 98% THC. Now that's just not possible, not at all. So another thing, is the sample prep accurate and homogenized? So have they made sure that it's an even mixture in the sample that's going to be analyzed? And are they using the right machine for the job? So different machines will test and determine the presence of different things. Have you actually got the right machine for what you want to analyze? And how could standardization help with this? So if there was a regulatory body, they could inspect facilities, they could ensure that the processes are appropriate for the process and are standardized. This could be implemented with mystery shopper style blind testing, and that could help to give a truly sort of unbiased view, because if someone doesn't even know that a mystery shopper is coming in, and if that mystery shopper doesn't care for THC levels, they just want an accurate analysis, well, that's going to make it difficult for labs that want to cheat the system. They can ensure uniformity across the whole industry. They could remove charlatans from the scene, remove these labs who will take bribes for higher THC levels, and it would help instill trust and confidence in the customers, the people who are relying on these test results to know that the product they've got is what they've got. So how can the home grower standardize in some way? Well, there's a few ways that you could use mother plants and tested cuttings. That way you know that at least what you're growing is genetically identical each time. As I said earlier, if you're growing from seed, there's phenotype variation, which means you're likely not going to get two plants that are chemically identical. They might appear identical, they might smell identical, but the chemical makeup of those plants will vary. You need to replace your bulbs very frequently. Light rails are a great way as well. If you can use those in your growing space, they ensure an even distribution of light. If you've got lights that just sit above the plants in the middle, directly underneath, are going to get bombarded with light, and they're actually going to get more lumens than those plants on the edge. So if you've got light rails which are constantly moving your light back and forward, that's going to give a much more even distribution. You need to maintain your temperature and humidity. We all know how difficult it can be in summer, but you need to make sure you stick to those things, those parameters that you set. You need to plan a feeding schedule and stick to it. And you need to repeat this every time, because if you change things in your grow to try and dial it in, and you've changed multiple things, it's impossible to tell what was responsible for the change you see. So you really need to do multiple cycles and change one thing at a time to determine what is best and what gives you the results that you want. One thing that may seem obvious, but apparently not to a lot of people, is you need to keep animals out of the grow rooms, especially if you think that you're growing a medicinal product. Now, it's not very popular, but Bedrocan, who are a producer of medical cannabis in the Netherlands, they actually treat all of their cannabis with gamma radiation before it comes out. And they do this to remove all the bacteria. There have been studies, it doesn't alter the chemical composition at all. It decreases the level of terpenes very slightly. But people go hysterical over this at the same time whilst they're eating their microwave meal, which went through the exact same process. So it's, if you don't want to gamma irradiate your cannabis, sure, but don't let your cats and your dogs into the tent, because you don't know where they've been. You don't know what they've got on them. And cleanliness is next to godliness. Even dusting the reflectors. If there's dust collecting on the reflector, again, you're going to have a reduced light content getting to your plants. So how could you standardize small-scale extraction? Well, for one, you'd need to use the same solvent from the same source. So even if you're buying the same solvent each time, if you change where you buy it from, there will be differences in the solvent. You need to keep the solvent to plant matter ratio constant. So if you're extracting on 10 or 100 grams of cannabis or a kilo, you need to make sure that there's a set amount of solvent that you use, whether it's 10 milliliters per gram, 100 milliliters per gram, whatever it is, you just need to keep that solvent to matter ratio constant so you know, again, when you change other things, what is responsible. This one's the difficult one, using identical starting material where possible. Now that's almost impossible in an illegal, unregulated market. As I said earlier, cuttings can help, but that doesn't guarantee anything. You need to control your solvent and material contact time. So FICO is one extract, full extract cannabis oil that's made by soaking cannabis for a very long time, and that pulls a lot of compounds out. You've got a similar process called QWET, QWET, which is quick wash ethanol extraction. And that's a similar process, except you're only letting the plant material touch the alcohol for a very short amount of time. Now, this reduces the pickup of chloroplasts and other compounds that aren't necessarily so medicinally beneficial, and they're certainly not the kind of compounds that you want if you're going to be dabbing your extract. You need to purge at a known temperature, pressure, and for a known amount of time. So if you're varying any of these in your purging process, you don't have a standardized purging process. And you can't possibly hope to say, oh yeah, it's clean, I know there's no solvent in it. If you're not even following the same process every time, there's no way you can claim that without lab analysis. So conclusions, without standardization, we'll never have the same product except from the same batch. And even that can vary. Without knowing our chemical composition, we can never hope to know the mechanism of actions of our preparations. We can never know how something works, why it does what it does, if we don't even know what is in there. A standardization in testing is the only way to ensure both accidental and deliberate mistakes are stopped. Again, with those labs, many of the labs actually have genuine mistakes. They're not deliberately inflating THC levels. You can give them the same thing, test it 3 times, 3 different times, and you'll get 3 different results. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to give you a higher THC level to get you as a repeat customer. But people do make mistakes. And if there's no regulation and standardization, then those mistakes are more common. A regulation is coming. And unless we're proactively implementing it, then it will just come in as government regulation. And at that point, anyone who's trying to do something for themselves will be priced out. Because when things come in as government regulation, it's expensive. And then it's going to be large corporations who dominate the scene because they're the only people who can afford to actually set up and operate legally in this industry. So we need to show that we're willing and trying to do this already, because by the time the rules come in, if we're working at that level, it's not going to be a problem. And if we don't work to that level, then the whole industry will go, and it will just be corporations that replace it. Yeah, so that's everything I had, and yeah, thanks very much.